Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson, and this is your Monster of the Month. Once again, it's read by Ben Tucker into the public domain through LibriVox. This is the origin story of Niogtha, which those of you who've played Call of Cthulhu will have had an encounter with. Fortunately, he's now entered the public domain.
The Seventh Incantation by Joseph Payne Brennan. Read by Ben Tucker. Of these black prayers or incantations there be 7, 3 for ordinary charms and aids, and the like number for the unholy and complete destruction of all enemy. But of the 7th, the curious in all these parts are warned. Let not the last incantation be recited, unless ye desire the sight of most awful demon. Although it be said, the demon shows not, unless the words be spake by the bloody altar of the old ones, yet it were well to beware. For it be known that the Saracen sorcerer Malazal did wantonly chant the dire words, and the demon did come, and not finding a bloody offering did rage at the wizard, and rend him exceedingly. The lifeblood of a child or a chaste maid be best, yet a beast, a good ox or sheep, is said sufficient. But beware lest the beast be dead when the blood be taken, for then shall the demon's rage be dire. If the offering be well, the demon shall give unholy power, so that the servant grow rich and reach above all his neighbors. For the 3rd time, and with growing excitement, Emmett Telquist read the fated words. They were contained in a crumbling and curious and probably unique bound manuscript book which he had discovered quite by accident some days before, while shuffling through the dust-laden packing crates which held his deceased uncle's library. The book was entitled simply True Magic, and the writer signed himself Theophilus Wynne. Quite possibly the name was a pseudonym. Certainly, judging by the contents, the rash author must have had reason to keep secret his real identity. The book was a veritable encyclopedia of devil's lore. There was everywhere manifest a genuine and erudite scholarship which had been lavished on a vast variety of esoteric and forbidden subjects. There were detailed discussions on enchantments and possession, paragraphs on vampirism and ghoul legend, pages devoted to demonology, witch worship, and eldritch idols, notes on Holocaust rites, unspeakable maculations, and fearsome full-moon sacrifices to the powers of pristine darkness. Evidently the writer had been a necromancer of note. The style in general was arbitrary and assured, betraying egoism and not a little arrogance. There was no faint note of humor. Theophilus Wynne, or whoever it was that disguised his true identity under that name, had written in dire earnest. Of that there could be no doubt. Emmett Telquist, the village outcast, the bitter misanthropic issue of an infamous father and a mother who had died insane, regarded the book as a sudden treasure, a secret storehouse of knowledge and power which would enable him to compete with his more successful neighbors. He had always been an outsider, a misfit, the subject of vindictive local gossip and criticism. He had always felt himself more or less allied to inhuman laws and agencies. His uncle, the only relative he ever remembered, had been a sour, black-hearted, brooding old man who tolerated him only because of the chores and errands which he performed. He never had had the slightest doubt that his uncle would have disowned him utterly had he not been a useful drudge. The bond of blood would have been meaningless to the old man. As a matter of fact, had it not been for his sudden and somewhat mysterious death, the scoundrel probably would have seen to it that his nephew inherited only black memories. But since no will had been located, Emmett Telquist had gained possession of his uncle's rambling farmhouse, and such meager chattels as it contained. But as he squinted eagerly at the quaint, faded handwriting of the necromancer, Theophilus Wynne, Telquist began to believe that the manuscript book was by far the most valuable item which his evil relative had unintentionally put into his hands. Furthermore, a number of matters which had always puzzled him in the past became less baffling. He had often wondered about the peculiar behavior of his uncle, his long absences from the house, especially at night, the muttering and mumbling which frequently came from his room, his unexplained sources of income. With a sense of mounting suspense and expectation, he turned to the pages whereon the Seventh Incantation was inscribed. It was written in a peculiar bluish-gray ink which seemed faintly phosphorescent. He did not dare to read the words. He merely glanced at them, ascertaining that they were what appeared to be merely a jumble of meaningless vowel sounds, frequently interspersed with the name Nyogtha. Grinning slyly to himself, he turned back the pages and reread the paragraph which served as an introduction and explanation of the incantations. Well he knew what Theophilus Wen had in mind when he referred to the bloody altar of the old ones. He, Emmett Telquist, had seen such an altar. Although that had been years before, when the swamp was not as nearly impassable as it had since become, he had no doubt that he could locate the accursed sacrificial cromlech. How well he remembered crawling along the faint raised pathway which wound through the swamp. The sudden, unexpected knoll, dark, somehow, even in the midday sunlight. The circle of huge monoliths. The mound in the center. The enormous, flat slab on its top. Rusty red with an unspeakable eldritch stain, which even the rains and winds of centuries could not blot out. He had never spoken of his discovery to anyone. The swamp was a forbidden place. Ostensibly because of rumored quicksands and poisonous serpents, but on more than one occasion he had seen old-time villagers cross themselves when mention was made of the area, and it was said that even hunting dogs would abandon the pursuit of game, which fled into its fastnesses. Already anticipating the power which would ultimately be his, Emmett Telquist began to formulate plans. He would not make the mistake of the unfortunate Saracen sorcerer, Mal Lazal. Although he did not quite dare to take the necessary steps to secure a human sacrifice, a child or chaste maid, a sheep should be relatively easy to obtain. He could steal one at night from any of the several village flocks. He knew all the woods and lanes and would be safely away with his prize long before the loss was discovered. The night before the advent of the full moon, he slipped into a nearby pasture where sheep were grazed and made away with a fine fat ewe, shoving and dragging it over a stone wall, and then leading it off along circuitous back roads and grass-grown lanes. The next day he paid a stealthy visit to the environs of the forbidden swamp, exploring the rank underbrush until he discovered the start of the faint trail down which he had stolen years before. Although it was partially obliterated by a thick growth of sedges, vines, and lush swamp grass, there were indications that deer used it occasionally. Probably patience would be required to force a way through, but at least the path should not be impassable. Carefully noting its location, he returned home and completed his preparations for the evening. Shortly before 11 o'clock, he crept into the shed where he had tethered the ewe and led it forth into the moonlight. The countryside was steeped in a bewitching silver light. He experienced no difficulties in reaching the swamp, and after some little searching, located the narrow trail. But as he plunged into the shoulder-high grass, the tether tightened in his hand. The ewe strained against the rope, its eyes suddenly wild with fright. Cursing, he scrambled around and kicked it brutally. It bolted forward a few yards and stopped. Grimly determined, he tightened the tether until it cut through the ewe's wool into its hide. He made progress by the foot and by the inch. The ewe had to be dragged and shoved at regular intervals. And as he penetrated toward the heart of the swamp, the increasing height and thickness of the lush undergrowth made passage more difficult. Moonlight filtered down eerily among the trees, and on all sides treacherous pools gleamed silver-black in the shadowy darkness. Occasionally, hidden watchers stared at him out of the depths, and quite often enormous toads hopped into the path and regarded him with their ember eyes. They seemed to be devoid of fear, almost as if they considered the swamp their special domain, and deemed him incapable of harming them. He began to imagine there was something vaguely malignant about them. He had never seen them so large before, nor in such numbers. But probably that was merely because they were left unmolested in the swamp to breed and develop without encountering the artificial obstacles which would inevitably prevail in any less shunned area. As he pushed into the heart of the swamp, the gathering silence became oppressive. The ordinary night sounds ceased altogether, and only his own strained breathing broke the silence. The ewe became more obstinate than ever. All his strength was required to drag it along. It appeared, he imagined, to sense the fate which awaited it. Suddenly, so suddenly that he nearly cried aloud in astonishment, the underbrush ended, and he was standing at the base of the unhallowed knoll. It was just as he had remembered it. Huge menhirs, standing in a rough circle about a central mound upon which lay a large flat slab of a dark hue, which did not match the color of the surrounding monoliths. Over all, a shadow seemed to fall. And yet when he glanced upward, he saw that the full moon stood directly overhead. Shaking off the sense of dread which closed upon him, he started up the lichen-covered slope. But now the ewe sank upon its forelegs, and he was obliged to drag it inch by inch toward the circle of megaliths. He rather welcomed the exertion, however, for it freed his mind of the nameless fear which the cromlech aroused in him. By the time he had dragged the sheep alongside the ring of boulders, he was nearly exhausted. But he dared not pause to rest, for he knew that delay would be his undoing. He already had a wild desire to leave the ewe and rush back through the toad-infested swamp to the familiar outer world. Quickly slipping off the sheep's tether, he bound its legs firmly together, and with a tremendous heave shoved it onto the rust-colored sacrificial slab. Rejecting an almost uncontrollable impulse to flee, he unsheathed the hunting knife which he carried, and drew from his pocket the curious bound manuscript book, True Magic, by Theophilus Wen. He had no difficulty in locating the strangely sinister Seventh Incantation, for in the bright moonlight the unusual bluish-gray ink in which the characters were inscribed seemed actually luminous. Holding the book in one hand, and the knife ready in the other, he began to repeat the jumble of unintelligible sounds. As he read, the syllables appeared to exert some unearthly influence upon him, so that his voice rose to a savage howl, a high-pitched, inhuman ululation which penetrated to the farthest depths of the swamp. At intervals his voice sank to low gutturals, or a thin, sibilant hiss. And then at the last enunciation of the oft-repeated word, Nyogtha, there reached his ears as from a vast distance a sound like the rushing of a mighty wind, although not even a leaf stirred on the surrounding trees. The book suddenly darkened in his hand, and he saw that a shadow had fallen across the page. He glanced up, and madness reeled in his brain. Squatting on the edge of the slab was a shape which lived in nightmare. A squamous, taloned thing like a monstrous gargoyle, or a malformed toad which stared at him out of questing red eyes. He froze in horror, and a sudden rage flamed in the thing's eyes. It thrust out its neck, and an angry hiss issued from its mottled beak. Emmett Telquist was galvanized into action. He knew what the thing wanted. Lifeblood. Raising the knife, he advanced and was about to plunge it downward into the sheep, when a new horror seized him. The ewe was already dead. The unspeakable presence which squatted beside it had already claimed it. It had died of fright. Its eyes were glazed, and there was no indication that it still breathed. Remembering Theophilus Wen's warning, "Beware lest the beast be dead," Emmett Telquist stood like a stone statue, with the knife still upraised in his hand. Then he dropped it and ran. Darting between two menhirs, he plunged down the knoll and raced toward the swamp trail. Lifting its scaly neck, the presence on the slab looked after him and finally, hissing in fury, bounded off the stone and leaped in pursuit. One terrible shriek rang out, and presently the thing hopped back onto the slab, holding in its bloody beak a dangling, lifeless form, a fitting sacrifice.
Statistics eventually. Your saga may vary.